Just before we get started, I do want to say this video is brought to you by Mack Weldon. Go to mackweldon.com/brainfood for 20% off. And today we're answering a viewer question because Shani M asks us, why is there no E in the grading scale? While in the minority, some schools do hand out E letter grades, but the majority of schools in the United States, particularly beyond primary age, give the grades of A, B, C, D, and F. So where did E go? Rather than a failure on the part of academic institutions to know the alphabet, the simple answer is that F stands for fail. The other four grades are more or less considered passing, though in some school districts D is also a failing grade, which is why they go in alphabetical order. The F is considered separate as it denotes a failing grade and does not need to go in alphabetical order. It just so happens that fail starts with a letter that skips one letter in the alphabetical scale. That said, E was also used at one point. The first college in the United States to use a grading scale similar to the one we know today was Mount Holyoke College, an all-women's university in Massachusetts. Before that, Yale used a ranking system in 1785 where optimi was the highest mark, followed by second optimi, inferior, lower, and pejores, worse. William and Mary ranked students by number, where number 1 was the first in their class, and number 2 students were orderly, correct, and attentive. For a while, Harvard had a numerical grading system where students were graded on a scale of 1 to 200, except for maths and philosophy classes, which were 1 to 100. Yale had a 4-point scale in 1813, switched to a 9-point scale somewhere down the track, and then back to a 4-point scale in 1832. In 1883, there's a single reference to a student earning a B grade at Harvard, but historians haven't found additional documentation to back up the idea that a letter grade system was actually in place at that point. It is known that just a few years later, though, Harvard had a system of classes in place. Students were either class 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, with 5 being failing. That all brings us back to the 1897 Mount Holyoke system, which looked something like this. A, excellent, 95 to 100%. B, good, 85 to 94%. C, fair, 76 to 84%. D, barely passed, 75%. And E, failed, below 75%. A year later, Mount Holyoke modified their grading scale. B became anything from 90 to 94%, C was 85 to 89%, D was 80 to 84%, and E was 75 to 79%. Below that, they added in the dreaded F. In the following years, some version of this letter grading scale became popular across colleges and high schools alike, particularly as the number of students per teacher skyrocketed not long after this time, requiring a simplified mechanism for assessing students to save time and effort. As this happened, a lot of schools skipped E and went straight to F for fail. That said, after World War II, some schools, many in the Midwest, decided to go back to E for fail to keep things alphabetical, and they just got rid of F. It's further noted that some schools use U for unsatisfactory or N for no credit in place of E or F. Of course, in more modern times, the grading scale itself has been marked with an F or an E or a U or an N by many who believe that the system is no longer a good way to judge students' work. For one thing, there are variations across institutions. Some schools use plus and minus, some don't. Some say an A is 90% and up, or 93% and up, or 95% and up. Some consider a D to be a failing grade rather than a passing one, and so on. On top of all that, there are some major variations in terms of what it takes to get an A from one teacher compared to another, even in the same school. Yet both are weighted equally when, for example, applying to college, and in the extreme, the co-author of this script once had a computer science professor whose classes typically saw students awarded an A for as low as 10%. Although it should be noted that while you might think this might have been a rather generous professor, the opposite was the case, with anyone getting greater than 10% in one of the professor's classes needing to be an absolute god among mere mortals. But in the end, while not a perfect system, letter grades are a rather convenient way to generalize where a particular student is at academically in a given class, and let's face it, after college, nobody cares what your grades were anyway. What matters is just your grades looking good enough to get into said college. Speaking of looking good though, but in a different way, Mack Weldon, and I want to tell you about them just before we get into the bonus facts today. Now, back in April of this year, which is quite a while ago now, Mack Weldon sent me a t-shirt that they said wouldn't start to smell for a week. I wore that t-shirt for 8 days in a row, and it did not smell. Now, the technology that they used in that shirt has been put into these socks they sent me. These are brand new. I don't know how I feel about this, but I'm probably going to wear these until they start smelling. But don't do that. Let me do that for you. But just know that they're really anti-smell. Also, the shirt that I'm wearing today, this is by Mack Weldon. This is an OCBD, which is an Oxford cloth button-down shirt. It's absolutely, even outside of Mack Weldon stuff, the OCBD shirt is absolutely just generally what I always wear. Mack Weldon recently started making them, which is amazing. I apologize for the creases on one side here. I just took this out of the box, and I'm not the sort of guy who washes his clothes before wearing them. Oxford cloth is already the right choice for shirts. What's great about this is Mack Weldon took already a ridiculously comfortable shirt and they just added their extra comfort magic to it. Also, this month I ordered some non-clothing items. I have had the same wallet since I was 18 years old and it was looking a little worse for wear. Mack Weldon sent me this thing. It's this tiny little wallet. It doesn't have a change pocket, which, I'm an adult man. I don't need a change pocket. That's what actual pockets are for. It's just got a little space for cards and a space for cash, which is fantastic. Also, this bag I ordered, which I just slot my laptop into. Now, before, I just threw my laptop in with my clothes in my bag, which I know is not the best idea. Now, I've got an amazing bag. It's also got all these outside pockets for extra stuff, which are completely empty now, but I bet I could, put my little wallet in there. Fits perfectly. That's fantastic. So look, supporting Mack Weldon, it supports the show. I like it when Mack Weldon keeps sending me stuff to try on and show you guys, so it's extra cool if you support this sponsor. Go to mackweldon.com, enter the code BRAINFOOD, you get 20% off. Just do it now. This stuff really is fantastic. I also got some underwear and all that stuff, which you don't want to see me wear, but it's just great stuff. Go check it out, and let's get into the bonus facts. Have you ever wondered how the whole freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior thing came to be? Well, want to know more? It turns out the origins of this date back several centuries to Cambridge, where in 1688 it was noted the several degrees of persons in the university colleges: freshman, sophomores, junior soph, or sophster, and lastly, senior soph. That said, the origins of these individual terms go back even further, variously used separately before this. To begin with, a child of modern English, freshman dates back to the mid-16th century, where it invariably meant either newcomer or novice. Its use to denote a university student in first year also dates to the 1590s. As for sophomore, this is likely derived from folk who used two Greek terms, sophos meaning wise and moros meaning foolish or dull, thus very aptly meaning a wise moron. This dates back to the 1650s. By the 1680s, the term was used to designate university students in their second year of study. Moving on to junior, this dates back to the end of the 13th century, with junior always meaning in English someone younger, or more particularly, the younger of two. Defined in relations to their more learned and wise upperclassmen, early on, juniors were called junior soph or sophister. Seniors were denoted with sophister, wise, or senior soph, which means senior wise. Finally, since the mid-14th century, senior has been used in English to denote either an older person or one of authority. Derived from the Latin adjective of the same word meaning older, by the early 17th century it was being used to describe an advanced student, and since 1741, without any soph attached to it, has meant a fourth-year student. And now for another bonus fact. Next up, ever wonder why number 2 pencils used to be required for Scantron test forms? Well, want to know more? To begin with, you might be saying, used to? I mean, you don't still have to? Well, it turns out, despite what pretty much all teachers will tell you, not really. Modern Scantron systems are quite high-tech, using image sensors and sophisticated image processing algorithms. These algorithms can even pick out which oval has the strongest mark, so if your test is being processed by one of these new Scantron systems, you could fill out every bubble on the Scantron and it would simply pick the darkest shaded bubble in each row and assign that as your answer. That said, you can use pens, pencils, and even printer toner or ink if you want to run your Scantron through a printer to mark all your answers. Pencils are obviously still preferred over pens, giving you the ability to erase your answer. Also, generally speaking, you still want to use some form of grey to black colored marking device to ensure your Scantron form is read perfectly. Even still, anecdotal evidence has shown that even using shades of different colored ink or colored pencils will also work, though at this point the system isn't necessarily going to read your form perfectly. Further, if you pick a shade that is close to the color of the lines on the form, it might just ignore your markings altogether. On the flip side, the early models of Scantron machines were significantly less sophisticated. The earliest of these Scantron-like machines used electrical conductivity rather than light to read forms. Graphite is quite conductive and paper is not. not, so the machine simply had a mechanism at each location to make contact with the form and detect if an electrical current was detected across the area. These systems were used as early as the 1930s. As for the next generation of these systems, they read pencil marks by shining light through the paper and lucite light guides, which was then read through phototubes. With this antiquated system, for an answer to be read, the light must be completely blocked out by the pencil marking to register correctly. Graphite works well for this purpose because graphite molecules, which form tiny sheets of carbon, reflect much of the light that hits them and absorb most of the rest. It turns out black ink isn't opaque enough for those old Scantron systems. Further, lighter shades of graphite, such as in number 3 and number 4 pencils, weren't sufficiently opaque enough for those old systems to perform without error, as is generally required. Number 1 pencils would have worked fine, as they are darker than number 2 pencils, but unfortunately they also smudge easier when erased or accidentally rubbed with your hand as you mark the Scantron form, increasing the possibility of a false positive when the Scantron is reading your form. So number 2 pencils were just the right mix of darkness and hardness of the graphite clay core to block the light effectively, while also not smudging too much. One of the ways you can instantly tell whether whoever is processing your Scantron is using a modern system or not is whether the Scantron is double-sided. If so, it cannot be using an antiquated model, as the marks on the other side would interfere with the older system's ability to correctly read the Scantron form. Modern systems have no such problem. On a related note, Scantron forms used blue ink for the lines and outlines to the circles because these old systems were designed not to pick up the light in the blue spectrum. Newer systems are simply designed to ignore whatever color the Scantron form was printed in and generally self-calibrate. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button, subscribe to this channel. Also, check out our fantastic sponsor, Mack Weldon. They make this wallet, this shirt, this bag. It's all great stuff. Link below. And as always, thank you for watching.